Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here tonight to film my reaction videos or my ranking videos for the quarterfinals for the BookTube prize. So you've heard me talk about my participating in the BookTube prize several times this past year since the start of the year, and I was lucky enough to be able to judge in the last 2 months the quarterfinal round of the BookTube prize. I will link Robert from Barter Horde's video down below where he explains the process of how he came about designing this prize and how it works. And I think that's a really excellent video and will tell you all you need to know about the BookTube prize. So it's super fun to participate in. I've really enjoyed it. I participated. Was I a judge? Let's see. I was a judge in round 1, and then I was not able to participate in round 2, and then I was a judge in it wasn't the quarterfinals, I'm sorry, it was the semifinals this last round. So I was a judge in the semifinals, and I was in Group B, and it was, the problem with now that we're into the latter stages of the BookTube prize is that the books are all really good, right? Which is how you want it to be, but it makes it really difficult when you're judging. So I'm just going to talk about the books that I read, and I'll do them. I'll rank them in order from number 6, which is the worst place, to number 1, which is the best place. And I will just caveat it all by saying none of these books are bad books. These are all good books. I enjoyed all of them for different reasons. I just enjoyed some more than others. So let's just get into it. In my number 6 spot was The Great Alone by Kristen Hanna. This is a book that takes place in Alaska. It's a family drama. It's told from the perspective of a teenager. Well, she's younger than a teenager when the book starts, and through her teenage years. The dad is a Vietnam vet, and he is suffering from PTSD, although we didn't name it that back then. And he moves the whole family up to Alaska to a remote cabin, and stuff ensues, plot ensues, right? And my trouble with this book was not that it wasn't a good story. Kristen Hanna can tell a great story, and I was very much engaged with the narrative throughout. I really liked the characterization and the setting of Alaska, but my problem was it was overly dramatic. I mean, I have a hair or something in my eye right now. Okay. My problem was, especially towards the latter third of the novel, it was like every bad thing that could happen to this family happened to this family, and it was just like it got overly plot heavy and dramatic, and I lost my suspension of disbelief, I guess, in the narrative, and it was just too much for me, I guess. So it wasn't a bad book, just wasn't a book for me, I guess is how I'll leave it. And then in the number 5 spot, I put West by Carrie Davies, which is a very short novel. It's historical. It tells the story of a man who, upon reading in the newspaper, like this is in the 1800s, I believe, that there's been a discovery of fossils of giant creatures out west, leaves his home on the East Coast for the West, leaving his young daughter in the care of his sister because his wife and her mother has passed away. And so he's on this quest to see these monsters. Basically, he thinks he's going to find living creatures, that these bones weren't fossils of a dead critter that doesn't exist anymore. They were, in his mind, it's a living creature that he's going to discover if he goes west. Meanwhile, his daughter is having to deal with growing up by herself without either parent, with an aunt that doesn't seem to give, her much love. And it's sort of like a parable of the Western story where it demonstrates all the bad shit that happened to women when men just up and decide what they're going to do to fulfill their dreams and hopes, and women never get to make that choice. So I thought it was an interesting story. I enjoyed the read. It's very short, but again, the ending just was, I mean, the whole thing, the ending I just couldn't get on with very much. So I had to take points away from the ending not being what I thought was realistic for the story. So, but I did like the book. So it was sort of an average read for me. And then in number 4, I had Washington Black by Essie Adugian. Again, this is another historical fiction. I read this book a few months ago, not as part of the judging process, but just because I was interested in the story of a young boy who was born a slave on a plantation in the Caribbean, and it gets taken on by his owner's brother as a sort of assistant to his scientific inquiries, and once he becomes this brother's helper, he leaves the island and basically goes on an adventure around the world with the brother. And I thought this was a really great adventure story. It was very engaging and interesting throughout. I really loved the character of Washington Black. I thought he was really strong character. I really enjoyed seeing his view of the world as he traveled from place to place. You know, he ends up in the Arctic, he goes to Nova Scotia, he goes to Europe and ends up in Africa. So he's like traveling the whole world. And from his perspective, I thought the story was really good. Again, the ending was so weird that it knocked a few points off for me. But again, Essie Adugian is a great writer. She does some interesting things with this story, sort of takes a slave narrative and makes it a little bit different. So I enjoyed that aspect of it. I liked the science aspect and the nature writing in the book. I thought there's some excellent, especially during the point when Washington Black is in Nova Scotia, there's some excellent nature writing about the sea, and I really loved that part of it. But the latter fourth of the book was really weird and just got weirder and weirder, and I don't know, after talking it over with some friends, I guess, where the author was going with it, but it wasn't to my liking. So again, just another average read for me. All right, so now we're into my top 3. These are the books that I voted for to make it through into the next round, and I am super excited that they, in fact, all did make it through to the next round, so I feel very vindicated in my choices. But in the number 3 position, I put Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. This was the last book that I read, and it's the only one that I actually have a physical copy of to show you because I had to borrow it from the library. I had a really hard time getting a physical copy of this book. And in fact, it took me so long to get a physical copy of this book that I ended up getting the audio version on Scribd, and so I started this book listening to it on audio and then finished the last bit of it in the physical book. And I'm really glad that I did listen to this on audio in the end because the audio narration is excellent. And really, I think, enhanced my enjoyment of the story. But I had read Song of Achilles last year or the year before, which tells this same story, basically, from Achilles' perspective, or Patroclus' perspective. And this book tells the story of the siege of Troy from the perspective of Briseis, who is captured when, is it Linasus? Her city gets captured basically by the Greeks, and she becomes a war prize for Achilles. And so this is her narrative of basically going from being a queen to being a slave, and the perspective of being in the war camp and what it was like for the women in this war camp, not just the women who were made basically sex slaves or bedmates or whatever, however you want to call them, but the women who prepared the food, the women that worked in the hospital, the women that did the laundry, the women that laid out the dead. And I found that perspective really, really fascinating. I mean, you still get some of our Achilles' perspective as the book goes on. Some of the chapters are narrated from his point of view. But I thought that was really interesting as well, because I had just read Song of Achilles, and which was Patroclus's point of view, and so to hear Achilles' point of view, I feel like I've gotten all the points of view now. But I really, really liked this perspective from the women's point of view of what it would have been like to be in a war zone, to be in a camp where an army is living and making war on another population. What that would have been like for women who had lost, their sons and daughters and their husbands and brothers and fathers, and they still had to, get up every day and put one foot in front of the other, and how they managed that. And it really was something to make you think, not just from the perspective of this, this myth of, not myth, but this historical, which is myth because Achilles is not totally human, but the Siege of Troy being a historical event, and then thinking about what war is like now, still some of the same aspects of what the women had to deal with are, you have to deal with today. So I just thought it was fascinating. Plus that Pat Barker writes a heck of a story. I mean, I did not want to stop listening or reading this book. I just blew through it. And what gets me about this is the same as some of the other books. I never would have picked this book up if not for the BookTube prize, because I don't think I'm interested in myth retellings, nor am I wouldn't have been interested in this story because I just read the Song of Achilles like a year ago, and so I'm like, what do I need to read that story again for? And it's so good. I actually like this better than Song of Achilles, and I want to read more Pat Barker now. So that I really love that book. And then in place 2 is a book that I read. Again, I read not because I was judging it, but because it was on this list, but not, I read it a few months ago, and that is Fruit of the Drunken Tree by Ingrid, Contreras is her last name. Hold on, I've written it down here somewhere in my book. Ingrid Rojas Contreras. And this narrative is about, it takes place in the 1990s in Colombia, and it follows 2 young women. One, a young girl who's, like 8 or 9 years old, and her fascination with their newly hired housekeeper who's a teenager. This housekeeper comes from one of the poorer areas of the city, basically the slums, lives in a put together shack from found materials, and there's all kinds of violence in the community. There's basically drug lords are running this part of Colombia, and there's constant threats of violence to everybody, and the sort of middle class folks live behind these gated homes, and our narrator is one of these people. She lives in a sort of a middle-class home. Her dad works away in some kind of like petroleum type industry. And so it's just her and her sister and her mom and this housekeeper who she's fascinated with. And as that sort of relationship develops between the youngest daughter and this housekeeper, the youngest daughter is exposed to more and more of the negative aspects of her home and her culture and her community, and how those things play out, and what happens to the housekeeper as well, because you're getting her perspective as this goes on, and the perspective of the young girl growing up with privilege and the young girl growing up in poverty and having to make difficult choices in order to survive was really fascinating. As far as the geography goes, I'd never read anything set in Colombia before. I didn't know much about this period in history, and I loved it. And this was a book that was super strong. The setting was strong, the characters were strong, the narrative remained strong throughout. I felt very invested in all of the characters and wanting them to all have good outcomes, even though I knew that the chances of that happening were very slim. I was fascinated by the mother in this story and the choices that she made and why she might make those choices. And it just shows, again, as in Silence of the Girls, how women are in positions where they have to make choices because of things men are doing around them. And I just find that such a fascinating story, and I'm so glad that we're getting more and more of those types of stories being told, especially from different parts of the world, not just US or UK-centric stories. And I just thought it was amazing, and I definitely want to read more of Contreras' writing as well. And then, of course, that leaves me with my number one pick, a book that, again, surprised me. Again, a book I probably would not have gotten to if not for the BookTube prize. And that is another new-to-me author, A Ladder to the Sky by John Boyne. I am not a person that needs my characters to be likable, and certainly the main character of A Ladder to the Sky is not a likable person. I can't remember characters' names. I'm really terrible with it, and I don't have a copy of this book either because I had to borrow it from the library. But basically, it's a story of a not very adept writer and his rise to fame in how he achieves success as a writer, not by having talent, but by using people, basically. And along the way, he encounters all kinds of people and events. Sort of historically, we follow this writer throughout his life. And so we get him from as a child growing up in Germany. I'm sorry, he didn't grow up in Germany. He went to Germany and met a German and got that person's story and wrote about it. It was just fascinating, and it reminded me of a book I read a few years ago called Any Human Heart by William Boyd. It had that same sort of conceit where your main character meets famous people or is in place to observe big events, big historical events, and that sort of the main character's story is told as these encounters happen. For example, he ends up staying for a weekend in Gore Vidal's villa that he's rented in some Mediterranean place, and has a very interesting interaction with Gore Vidal. This is a LGBTQ themed novel as well. The main character, has some encounters that way, and it's just fascinating narrative of a person who's just a terrible person. He's really not a good person at all, but yet, John Boyne makes you care about him. You care about him even though you know he's terrible, and that is what makes it such a great book, I think. And it was, again, just propulsive. I couldn't put it down. I wanted to be reading it all the time. So that, to me, is the best praise I can give a book, is that I would do anything to keep reading this book rather than put it down. I want to avoid all other activities and just read this book. So that was how I felt about A Ladder to the Sky, and that was why it was my number one pick for this round of the BookTube prize. I had a super fun time participating. Again, I'm looking forward to I am a judge in the next round, in the finals. So excited, and I'm really excited about it because there's only one book in the mix that I have not yet read, although there's one other book that I read last year before the BookTube prize even started, so I'm going to reread that one as well before I make my final choices. But the books that made it through are fantastic, and I'm super excited about all. If any of them win, I'm going to be happy because they're all great books, although we'll see, because I haven't read. I'm not going to make any predictions. Let's just say that. But super excited to be participating in the final round. Thanks again, Robert, for all of your hard work in putting this prize together. I'm having such a blast with it, and I can see that in the future it's just going to grow and get bigger and better. All right, guys, that's it. I hope that my rambling about these books made some kind of sense and gave you some indication of what they were like for me. And I will talk to you later.